today's show by Alison Hills. Alison is a resident of St Albans who's found herself in the middle of the cladding crisis that is affecting potentially 200,000 homes in the UK. So, Alison, welcome to the show. Can you give an overview of your situation, how you originally bought the property and what's happened over the last few years?
Yeah, sure. So in 2014, my mum very sadly passed away. Shortly following this, my dad was diagnosed with cancer, and the property was too much for him when he was ill. So basically, he sold up his house and bought my flat with the proceeds of sale of his property. The plan was for me to essentially give him a sort of monthly rent so that I could pay for his pension. But a few months after we bought the flats, essentially, the government changed the regulations after Grenfell in terms of building safety regulations. We had to have an intrusive survey completed, which is when it was flagged up about all the fire safety defects, which didn't just include cladding. So as soon as we found out we had a waking watch in place, we also had to pay for an alarm system. And this was also happening in the middle of lockdown. So I was basically stuck in this flammable flat that I knew could catch fire during the middle of lockdown. So I couldn't go out apart from sort of the daily hours exercise. So it was getting all too much of my mental health. So basically I moved out and I'm now renting somewhere else. But we can do nothing with that because it's worth nothing and we can't sell it. We've put in claims to the government fund and to NHBC, but we're just in absolute limbo at the moment and nothing has really happened. So, yeah, it's a bit of a nightmare to say the least.
And you did mention Grenfell. Obviously, the whole fire safety issue was highlighted at the Grenfell Tower, which is 4 years ago since that tragedy. Lots has been said about cladding, but you mentioned there are other fire safety defects which are affecting homeowners, including your property. What sort of things are they?
So we've got flammable cladding, but it's not the same type they had at Grenfell. It's called HPL cladding. But in addition to that, we've also got Kingspan insulation, which is considered to be highly flammable. It's actually the same type of insulation they had at Grenfell. And in the Grenfell inquiry, it's actually been described as a raging inferno. In addition to that, we've also got missing fire breaks, missing cavity barriers. We've got flammable materials on our balconies. And that's what we know of the external issues. We haven't actually had an intrusive internal survey, but that's what we've been told so far.
So in a statement in February, the Minister of Housing, Robert Jenrick, said that under the scheme, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding. Now, obviously, we don't know how a month that is, but you know how long that would go on for. But what is generally your perspective on that statement? And do you think this is a realistic outcome?
No, it's completely misleading and inaccurate. The scheme that he's talking about actually applies to buildings just between 11 metres and 18 metres in height, which ours isn't. It also only applies to the removal of cladding. It doesn't relate to any other fire safety defects, such as the missing fire breaks. It also doesn't take into account the fact that people are paying extortionate amounts for waking watch, for alarm systems, for service charge increases, for insurance increases. For example, our service charge alone has increased from £33 a month to over £200 a month since all of this has happened. We had to pay £400 a month for waking watch. And as I say, this loan scheme he's talking about only applies to buildings between 11 and 18 metres in height. Ours is actually over 18 metres. And we can technically apply for the Government Building Safety Fund, but that's another story. There's a huge amount of issues with that as well. So as I say, it is completely inaccurate what he's saying. It doesn't take into account a huge number of the defects which don't relate to cladding.
So you mentioned just height of the building seems to be important, significant difference in terms of the grants or the funding that's available. What is that specifically all about? Obviously, I suppose the higher the building, the more risky. Potentially?
Yes, essentially. We're in a building which is over 18 metres in height, and if you are in a building which is over 18 metres, you can apply for the government fund. But this, again, only relates to cladding. It doesn't relate to any of the other fire safety defects. If you're in a building between 11 and 18 metres, then the government have been they're in the process of setting up this loan scheme, which is capped at £50 a month, but the cost we've seen, it could take people 150, 200 years to actually pay that off, which just shows the absolute lunacy of it all. Again, that doesn't actually include any non-cladding related defects either. And if you're in a building under 11 metres, you get no help whatsoever. So, yeah, each height of building, there's significant problems with the government's response and with the funding of any type of building, essentially.
This is a national issue. I think I said at the beginning, there's potentially 200,000 homes in the UK that are affected. You're living in St Albans. I'm sure there are many others, both in your building, but elsewhere in St Albans, suffering from the same situation. Have you spoken with many people in a similar situation here in the city?
Yes, I mean, our block is the only one which has been affected in Charrington Place. There's 44 leaseholders in that building alone. But I know that there is another block affected, Newsom Place, I believe. They're actually under 18 metres, but there could potentially be hundreds of people affected in St Albans. And I've also been in touch with a lot of people in Stevenage, Luton, Hemel, so that, you know, this is a national crisis essentially. But I know that, as I say, there's 44 in our development alone, and there could be hundreds in the city, because obviously these building safety regulations have been very poor for a number of years, and this is where the crisis is stemmed from.
You featured in the Sunday Times last week, alongside several others in the same or similar situations, where property owners, they're facing bills that are a significant percentage of their purchase price of the property, and in some cases more than even the actual value of the property. So the repairs are costing more than the property's worth. In the article, people are talking about loans, forcing bankruptcy, and even potential eviction by leaseholders if they can't pay for the repairs. What do you see as the worst case for you particularly, and best case potentially of the outcome for your situation?
Worst case would just be an absolute nightmare, because if I became bankrupt, I would actually lose my career as well as my home, because I'm a solicitor.
You're a solicitor, yeah.
Yeah, so if I was made bankrupt, that would be my career just completely destroyed. The cost we're talking about in our building could equate to around £150,000 to £200,000 each. The flat was only bought for £300,000, so you can see obviously how impactful this is. If we didn't go bankrupt, then there's a possibility we would just have to sell on a cheap to a cash buyer. But then 75% of our equity would just be wiped out in an instant. So these are the sort of figures we're looking at. Best case scenario is that we do get government funding. We have technically been told that we are eligible, but there is a huge issue with the contract at the moment in that our managing agent is refusing to sign it because there's a number of onerous clauses in that contract, which is affecting not only us but a number of other buildings across the country. But if that issue is sorted out, we are hoping that at least the government fund will cover a majority of the defects. Or we also get some assistance from our developers or NHBC, because they actually built the building in breach of regulations. Our building was signed off with missing fire breaks, which should never have happened. So they do need to accept some responsibility as well.
And how old is that development? It's not that old, is it?
No, it's only 2013 it was built, so it's not even 10 years old yet.
Okay. Finally, you've been talking to lots of people about this. You're talking to ourselves today. I know you've been sort of involved with various other media outlets. I think we first came across your story in the newspaper, local newspaper. You've been talking to also, I think, our local MP, Daisy Cooper, and others. What are you hoping happens next in terms of actual next sort of realistic steps?
Well, there's actually legislation that leaseholders are trying to push through at the moment, which has been named the Polluter Pays Bill, which essentially means where buildings breached regulations at the time of build, then the developer should pay for those defects. But if the problem is due to the government changing regulations and retrospectively applying them, as has happened in our situation, then the government pays. This would basically reduce the burden on the taxpayer and the leaseholder and make sure that the right people are held to account. So that's one thing that we're trying to push at the moment. The second issue is obviously trying to get this contract issue resolved with the government fund, because at the moment we're just at an absolute standstill because no contracts are getting signed, no funds are getting released, and our buildings are remaining unsafe. So that is another priority for us. In addition to actually getting a response from NHBC, who signed our building off, we actually put a claim into them about a year ago and we still haven't heard anything back. So that's another thing that we're obviously trying to push.
Okay, well, thanks for the time today, Alison. This is a traumatic situation. I really appreciate talking to us here at Radio Verulam. Really hope that you can find an acceptable outcome and others that are in the same situation here in the city. But thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.